This episode's guest is someone who, as a little boy, loved playing with dolls, and we are all better off because he did. John, along with his partner Myles, owns Village Square Booksellers in Bellows Falls, Vermont. It's a wonderful independent bookstore with an incredible toy department and, as you'll soon discover, a truly spectacular doll collection. Together, they also run an eBay business called The Doll Bunny, specializing in vintage dolls and doll accessories. But this conversation is much more than dolls. It is about creativity, authenticity, and having the courage to embrace the things that bring you joy, even when they don't fit other people's expectations. Great conversation. I learned a lot from John. I think you will too. It is thoughtful, heartfelt conversation that stayed with me long after we finished recording this. I hope you enjoy this episode of Eager to Know.
Hey Rick, welcome to Village Square Booksellers in downtown Bellows Falls, Vermont, home of the Doll Bunny. Come with me. So this is the start in our toy department of the doll shop. So we have modern toys and dolls, and then we go into some vintage. Here we have a representation of vintage Barbie and other fashion dolls from the 60s and 70s. And that's kind of an intro into the more collector dolls in the boutique.
So it's interesting, this Barbie case up here, I remember my neighbor growing up had that Barbie case. I was probably 7 years old, and I remember that would have been from the 1970s.
Yes, and that's exactly why we kind of have them here, because we find for introducing people to the world of doll collecting, starting with things that are nostalgic and a little bit more modern history, it helps them understand the progression into the earlier types.
So this is just the teaser of the doll collection, and now we're about to get serious.
Yes, and it gets more advanced and more specialized the further we go.
Wonderful, let's go.
So in this corner, we have a lot of the earlier dolls that tend to date from like the mid-19th century up to the turn of the century. And there are dolls made of all sorts of materials, from wood, porcelain, glazed and unglazed porcelain, cloth, paper mache. Predominantly, a lot of them were produced in Germany because they were the largest producer of dolls in the 19th century, with France kind of coming just after that. And then there's also quite a few American companies. We have Greiner dolls from the mid-19th century from Philadelphia that were made here by a German immigrant. And then we have the Schoenhut dolls, which were made also in Pennsylvania, that are of wood and were made from the early 1900s up through like the 20s and 30s. And then we have a lot of German porcelain dolls that were produced from the mid 1800s on.
The dolls that were made in Europe, would those be enjoyed by people and purchased by people living in the United States?
Yes, at the time, the United States was one of the largest markets that they had,
Wow.
and they imported millions of dolls a year.
Wow.
From Germany.
Were these something that would be used as a toy, or would these be used as a piece of decorative art?
Yes, predominantly they all started out as toys. There were a few things made for exhibitions and displays and shop windows. Some of the larger bisque dolls that you sometimes find at the turn of the century would have been made to actually display children's clothing in stores and things like that.
Wow.
But mostly they were toys. And Sears and Roebuck and catalogs like that started at that time in the late 19th century. They started to do a lot of things that were imported and were selling to the American market.
This guy here is really interesting and scary looking.
Yeah, this is a piece we just got in, quite rare. He dates from the 1880s or so. And he is an automaton. He's a key wind mechanism.
Wow.
And he's a beer drinker, so he plays music and he throws his head back and the mouth opens and he brings the stein up to his mouth.
So that would have been probably collected by an adult male.
Yes.
And he would keep this like in his man cave, I guess, type of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and some of these were also used in bars and
Yeah.
in shop windows to attract attention.
Right.
And then they were also like parlor toys for adults as kind of a whimsical thing to show off to their guests.
The garments that are on these dolls are these original or are they were they made recently? I mean, because this is unbelievable. Like,
So this one is a recreation.
okay.
It's exactly the correct, style for the
Yeah.
mid 1850s, early 1860s. But then the other ones here by the same type of paper mache, these all have period original clothing. A lot of dolls were manufactured with clothing, and specifically the French dolls, which I have a few over here I can show. Um, they would have been dressed by, really experienced couturiers and clothing seamstresses and so forth. Sometimes it was the factory that produced the clothing.
Yeah.
Sometimes the factory would buy the doll from another manufacturer, and then they would do the costuming. Sometimes they came with an entire wardrobe or trousseau, and then sometimes the dolls were dressed at home as well.
Do you want to take a look at the French ones?
Sure. So I have a few examples of French dolls here from different time frames. The four on the top here, these are all antiques from the 1860s and 70s era. And these are dolls that would have been predominantly made in Paris, mostly for a wealthier clientele of tourists coming through the city of Paris and bringing something home for a niece.
For their daughter or niece or something.
Exactly. Yeah,
Interesting.
they were luxury gifts, and usually they would have been very expensive at the time. And I think this is probably the only one that has completely original clothing. The rest of these are all in antique, of the time frame. And then to show a little bit later, this is a French doll that would have been made more in the child style.
Can I touch that?
Yes. And she is in her completely original costume with her original wrist tag from the
Wow.
early 1900s. And this would have been more of a typical play doll of that slightly later era.
I'm curious, have you had young girls take a look at these dolls and like how do they respond to them?
It's difficult these days. I don't feel like recent generations have really focused on that, and the idea of doll play, doll collecting, sewing is very alien to children today. And
Really?
I think that's a shift we've been seeing probably in the last 20 years or so,
Yeah.
where people don't seem to understand it the way they did. And when I got involved in dolls, when I was a very small child, I was always interested and fascinated by dolls. Everything from, mannequins in store displays to animated figures, puppets, play dolls, fashion dolls. The trend has been away from that. And that's part of what we're doing here is trying to bring back a little bit of that educational aspect and history around the dolls and the artistry used in creating them. Because then we fast forward to a more modern time, and these two are by a modern French artist named Heloise. And she does very small editions that are handmade in France. And these are not made as play toys. These are artist pieces that are meant for collectors. And so I like to have an example of different types showing, the sort of high-end educational, social sort of play, the regular child play, child companion, and then the sort of artist pieces that are made more for, just to be admired.
So coming in here, it looks random. It is clearly not random. This is extremely well thought out, and you're very thoughtful and knowledgeable. It's really wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, we kind of have things a little bit tighter than if I was like curating a museum and could really
Right.
put it together the way I would want.
Yeah.
We basically buy and sell a lot of dolls online, and I've just always wanted to have a brick and mortar location where I could meet with people and show people things in person. I feel
Wonderful.
like that's so much better than only seeing it in a photograph. But a space is a concern, And so we kind of have things crammed into a relatively small amount of square footage.
It looks wonderful.
Thank you.
It looks really wonderful. And what's interesting is I go into the bookstore all the time, and I didn't really know that I wasn't aware of the toy store downstairs. And I ventured into the toy store one day, and then I kept going and going and going, and then I realized there was this secret doll room. And that's when I contacted you, and I'm like, we need to talk about this.
Excellent.
And I want to share this with the world. John, I'm very curious about what you said about being interested in dolls as a kid, and I have lots of questions for you. So let's go talk about that some more.
Sounds good.
Tell me about young John as a young boy in Long Island with an interest in playing with dolls. Like, when did it start? How did you get exposed to it? Did that cause problems for you?
A little bit, but I was very lucky. My family was very understanding and very creative and supportive. I had one older brother, 2 years older. So we kind of played with similar things at the same time. Yeah. And so my parents would take us to the toy store or whatever. And I would always be obsessed with the mannequins. I saw them as big life-size fashion dolls. Yeah. And I wanted to take them home and play with them and sculpt faces like that and put outfits together and everything. And my brother would go for the dinosaurs and the trucks, and I would be in all the pink aisles with the dolls and the clothes. And
did you like the male mannequins as well as the female, or was it mostly the female?
Honestly, as a kid, it was more the female because it was more fashion oriented and not so boring. But now, as an adult collector, I enjoy the male figures just as much from a fashion perspective and faces and everything. But as a kid, I was always drawing girls and women and always into portraiture. Always into puppets, always into mannequins, dolls, statuary, carvings, anything with the human form, in any medium, and always interested in fashion and design and stage sets and theater
so you mentioned that your parents were very supportive with this, which is awesome. Do you feel that you were able to consistently engage with that part of you throughout your childhood, or was there any point where you sort of had to dampen it, or you had to move on to a track that was in life that was more reasonable and sensible?
I was always able to do it because my parents made it very clear at a very young age that they would support us no matter what. And having conversations with them as an adult, they always told me how when they got together, my father was an artist and he painted and drew and was very creative, and he was more technical, and he went into advertising and illustration and that kind of thing. And my mother was a nurse, but she did art as kind of a balance to her personality, to get away from the heaviness and to process things. And she would put it down in paint, and she never went to school for it, never, really studied, but she just did it by emotion. And so I had the two different spectrums of the artistic discipline. And my parents, my father worked in the arts, so he was very supportive that way. And my mother was a very emotional, intelligent person. And she saw it as a positive thing rather than something that would ostracize me from society or whatever. And they had the conversation, when we were toddlers, that like, if we're going to have kids, we're going to embrace and support whatever it is they're into, because they had both been steered away from the arts when they were children, mostly for, concerned parent practical reasons. They didn't want them to starve. They wanted them to be able to get a job and support themselves. So it was always discouraged, and they hated that. So they didn't want to make the same mistake. And I was very fortunate to have that. Just to save my own problems with schoolmates and stuff like that, my parents would try to discourage me from bringing dolls to school, show and tell, kindergarten, first grade. I had a Cabbage Patch Kid type doll with like pink yarn hair. First grade, I brought it to school, and
in first
grade, my parents were, so afraid that I was going to get picked on and be the kid with the dolls for the rest of my life, which I, and, that one day I came home from school and my mother had packed my dolls away and had gotten me a new like Tonka truck and, had tidied up my room, and the truck was sitting on the bed, but my room was like pretty emptied of all my favorite dolls, which, I was furious that my dolls were packed away.
And this was first grade?
This was like for kindergarten or first grade. It was very early on. I threw a tantrum, and my parents weren't giving in because it was for my own good and all that.
So they said this is for your own good?
Yeah, pretty much.
Could you tell?
I can't remember I was very young, but
Right, but the general message was we're basically protecting you from yourself.
And of course, I didn't understand it at the time. But then I was upstairs, and my mother was making dinner, and I snuck down while she was distracted, and I took all of her wooden spoons out of the baking cart that was in the kitchen, and I brought them upstairs, and I went into her closet, and I took all of her scarves, and then I drew with markers. I drew faces on all the wooden spoons, and I tied her scarves all over them and made them into like rod puppets. And they weren't mad at me. I mean, they kind of laughed, and they were like, "We're not going to change his direction. Like, this is what he wants. He's going to have dolls."
So wait a minute. This wooden spoon rod puppet, was this an act of rebellion?
Yeah, or was that I was going to have dolls, and so my mother took my dolls and put them away, and so I took her spoons and made them into dolls, and they weren't even mad. They really. I remember them laughing about it.
Looking back on that, or it's possible you've talked to your parents about this. Like, what do you think about them doing that, of hiding your dolls from you to protect you? What do you think about that now?
I think at the time, I mean, we're talking, early 80s.
Yeah.
And, there wasn't as much exposure or much visibility, of course, in the queer community, and so many different things, socially. And I was going to Catholic school, very conservative surroundings. And, they just saw that it would be problems for me. It's not that they objected.
No, I understand that.
And so, that's when we had the conversation, years later, when they relayed that story of me doing that, it was that they were just doing it to protect me.
Yeah.
And then they saw that I was just going to be too stubborn, and that's just the way it was. And I was going to be the kid with the dolls,
Was there any part of little John that was thinking, maybe I shouldn't be doing this? Or was there anything like that? Or were you?
Definitely.
There was.
Yeah. Cause I did get, teased and stuff like that. Okay. But only to a point, because I was, again, very fortunate to have understanding parents, but also, always being like one of the tallest, biggest kids in the class. I didn't really have to worry about, anybody bullying me.
Okay.
And even among like my friends, I always had creative friends and people who wrote poetry and people who drew, and, a lot of kind of misunderstood kids. And because I was physically, large, I was able to kind of protect them. And I always liked the fact that I could do that.
So what's interesting about what I'm thinking about is someone like yourself, and there probably was someone just like you that grew up in Kansas or something like that. You grew up basically in New York City. Did you ever consider, or did you consider moving into the city and pursuing a creative life that, you would have been able to plug right into that pole? Other people just...
I dreamed about it when I was younger, and probably up until like when I was graduating high school, I probably thought that was my path, that I'd go into fashion, I'd go to FIT or Parsons or something. And because I had two cousins that lived in Queens that both worked in design. One worked for a hosiery company. Her sister was an interior designer. One went to FIT, one went to Parsons, and they were about 20 years older than me. We were very close when I was a kid. I would go into the city to visit her and stay for the weekend. She would take me out to fancy restaurants and show me New York, and she would take me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I would sketch, the Greek statues and things like that. And she always saw herself as like Holly Golightly from Breakfast at Tiffany. She wanted to have that glamorous life and be in the city and be independent. And she did for many years. And she was really my mentor as far as lifestyle like that when I was so young.
That's great to have a vision so close to... I mean, it's always difficult when you are a kid and you don't see anyone that reflects who you think you are.
Right.
So, it's particularly tough growing up as a gay kid. As you know, I was growing up in the early 80s, late 70s, and certainly there were no public figures that I felt like I connected to or I could see myself in. And so that's really nice that you had someone, particularly as it relates to being a creative being in the world. That really wasn't my thing as a kid, but that's wonderful that you were actually able to see that in action in the center of the universe for being a creative individual in the world, right? Wouldn't you say New York City? And
absolutely the center of everything.
Right.
And, and I love that my parents saw that, when I was around the museums and things like that, I would light up, and they would encourage me to go stay with my cousin. And, cause they had no experience really with, the art scene or fashion or anything like that. But they didn't want to hold me back, cause they saw how much it meant to me. And so that having a cousin with a foot in the door in that world, they really left me free to explore that. But at the same time, morally speaking, going to Catholic school from first grade till I graduated high school, so it was a mixed bag. It was free to a point. Finally did come out in my early 20s, to them. They were very accepting, and compassionate. And I knew that they would never throw me out of the house or disown me or anything like that. But just that fear of disappointing them or something like that was always right there in the front of my mind. That, it was always, oh, well, he played with dolls and he was interested in fashion. Oh, cause he's going to be a great dad someday. And, he'll be a really loving father. And that kind of is how they justified it. And I didn't want to disappoint them that way, of course. But, so a lot of internal conflict, even though I didn't have the external, things blocking me. But it all kind of comes into the dolls, because that has always been sort of the culmination of all of my different artistic interests. Mostly when it came to drawing or painting, it was faces. I was always drawing faces on my school books, everywhere. And, really got into fashion illustration quite young, had read a book about Erte and, the early Vogue magazine covers from the teens and 20s, and absolutely inspired me. I loved that style, the Art Deco and even pre-Art Deco kind of modern, illustration style. And, it came from the theater costume designs and things like that. And just very creative and over the top and flamboyant and dramatic. And I just loved that, the ostrich feathers and the beads and
And you think that you can basically route all of that into dolls?
Yes.
That's so interesting.
And, even mannequins, I was really obsessed with vintage mannequins, particularly. Which they kind of started in the late 1800s, cause that's when department stores sort of became a thing. And you had, in Paris and New York and places, they'd have big store windows with plate glass that went right down to the street. And they have these wax mannequins, dramatically lit, wearing beaded Edwardian gowns and stuff. And the mannequins were 300-400 pounds. And I've always look for any books on the history of mannequins or the makers who were doing them at that time when it was a new art form, essentially, that type of retail display. I was always mesmerized by window displays and what they could do with the mannequins, especially in the city, in Bergdorfs and places like that. Just so inspiring.
Do they still do that today? Are they still?
They do. No, they do. Most of them have gone to a more generic, simplified style. I mean, it's still very cool, but, a few places like Bergdorf's are still doing the really theatrical window displays where they look like little stage sets.
So, John, do you feel that, so we don't live in New York City, we live in a small village in Vermont. Do you feel that all of this creative energy, activity, is it being satisfied with what you're doing?
Absolutely.
It is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So great to hear. So, most people are frustrated with, they wish they could be more creative, or they wish they could find a way to express themselves, or they wish they could, because I interview people all the time on this podcast. And the fact that you were able to answer that with such confidence makes me so happy.
Yeah, I feel like it took me a long time to get here to actually feel I'm where I'm supposed to be in my career, in what I do, in my hobbies, but I realize how fortunate I am, because most people don't get the chance to experience even a fraction of what they're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, if things had gone really well, I'd be in the city and I'd be doing, full-time windows on a really big scale. But I've always, I used to do.
We wouldn't have you.
Exactly.
And we're very grateful that we
Thank
have you here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I always enjoyed more doing the windows than having to be like on a schedule and, meet these like horrible corporate, stringent, time frames and have to always outdo yourself, or your entire career's on the line. I don't want that kind of pressure. But, I was always interested in the fashion, but realized it was way too competitive. And, I wanted to just design clothing that looked good. I didn't really care so much about reinventing wearable clothes. And, I enjoy dressing dolls because they don't complain. You can do whatever vision you want, and you can paint their face and pull their hair, and it doesn't matter. There's no client telling you that, no, that's too much or whatever. So it's kind of a limitless art form that way. And it allows you to use fashion. It allows you to sculpt different faces and their figural sculpture.
All right, John, this exceeded my expectations in terms of what we were going to talk about. I thought I was going to learn a little bit about dolls and your relationship with dolls, but I really learned a lot about you and what an incredible creative being you are in the world. And I'm so glad that we got to spend this time together. This was really awesome.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it too. And I hope it does, open some doors for people to, this just barely scratches the surface of all the different facets that people can get into. And I think just, be true to yourself and march to your own drum.
I love that. Great. And if people are interested in seeing your stuff on eBay or seeing the store in person, is there like an online address or something that they?
Yeah, the Doll Ani on eBay is our store, but we also have the brick and mortar location in the lower level of the bookstore.
Well, John, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.